So let's look up this thing called fetch. All right, browser API fetch. Here we go, web APIs. So what this will allow us to do is actually send AJAX requests without having to, without actually having to bring in an extra library. Okay. And if you guys are wondering how well supported fetch is, because it is kind of an important concern, you can go to this website caniuse.com and you can check different things to see if they're compatible with different browsers. So if I look up fetch, you'll see it is not compatible with IE11. Does anyone use that? Does anyone use IE at all?
Microsoft doesn't even want you to use that.
Yeah, exactly. So they're rebuilding Edge on top of the Chromium engine, right? Okay. So Opera Mini would not support it. BlackBerry browser. IE Mobile. So generally the support's pretty strong though. So we should be in pretty good shape. If we go back to what we were doing here with our Star Wars API, let's, instead of bringing in jQuery, let's just dump that. So take this out. Oops. And one little shortcut you guys may or may not know, if you're inside a line that you do not want to be there, you can do Command X and it will cut the entire line. Nice, right? Don't have to highlight it at all. Okay. So here, instead of all of this jQuery code, we're going to try to replace that with just some vanilla JavaScript using the actual fetch API. Okay. And we'll even replace this code here too when we were waiting for the document to be ready. And as well as this down here. So rather than referencing using the jQuery $symbol, we'll just do it with old-fashioned JavaScript. Okay, so let's try to replicate this stuff down here. And we're just going to target this specific button by ID. In the same way that we were doing with jQuery, only we're going to use a slightly different syntax. So we can say document.getElement by ID. And what's our ID? Our ID is button. Okay. And then I can add an event listener to this specific DOM element that will listen for clicks. So let's do .add event. Actually, I'm going to move on to the next line so it's not too much stuff. So we add an event listener, and the event that we're listening for is we're listening for a click event. So see, it's giving me some different events that I can listen for here. Blur, cancel. There are quite a few different events here, 79 more events. But the only one that we're interested in here is a click event. Okay. And then what's the next thing that I'm going to typically add here? A callback function. Exactly. And if I wanted to see some information about that actual event, I can have my function take in an event argument and then log that out if I wanted to look at it. So inside here, if I just wanted to see what the event was, I could do console.log e. And let me comment out some of the stuff down here. Okay, and let's load this guy up in our browser again. Open, where are we? Star Wars. Okay, so if I click this button, got my console open here, I'll actually see some information about the event. And there's a whole bunch of information here. You can also, if you're wondering which element triggered that event, you see it's available here in the target. Okay, and target is giving me a reference to that actual button that we clicked. But instead of doing that, we're still going to do our old logic, right? We're going to go grab some information from the Star Wars API. Okay, so inside here, get rid of this, and then let's grab some of this code. This is what we're going to be replacing, right? Let me just, whoops, rip that out, put it in here. Why am I putting it inside the event listener? This is kind of a key concept. Anybody? Yeah, we only want that to happen once the button is clicked. We don't want to just automatically run this thing, because then how many times would it run? It would happen one time, and that would be it, right? We wouldn't actually be responding to button clicks. So we're going to have to change some of this code inside here. We were creating a random. That was still good. But rather than doing a $.get, do we have access to dollar right now? No, because I'm no longer loading jQuery, right? We're going to use fetch. Exactly. It's so fetch. Yeah, I heard that. Okay. So let's run a fetch request. And then you see it's asking for some input here. So the first argument that we're going to give to fetch is what URL are we going to? And that's the exact same URL that we were giving to our $.get. So I'll just grab that here. And then fetch is promised based. Is anyone familiar with promises? Somebody. Yeah, all right. A little bit of promise familiarity. Okay.
I've experienced breaking them.
Okay. So in terms of JavaScript, what promises give us the ability to do is we can actually run some code to happen once a promise has been resolved. So what a promise is basically like we're saying presumably at some point in the future we're gonna get something back. Okay, I promise I'll give you some information. Well, does that always happen? Do I always make good on my promises? No. So, what's that?
You're more like you usually do.
No, I do, but yeah, but not everybody does, right? Yes. If I say I promise I'll do this, well, you may think that I will, but I may not be able to, right? I told him that I would unlock his track farm, but I ran into a slight issue, so it's like. Might say, hey, you didn't follow through on your promise. But what we can do is we can chain these things together. So once a promise is resolved, I can specify I want some code to run now that this thing has resolved. Or I can also specify I want something to run if my promise didn't come back as expected, if it gave me back an error instead. All right. So that's the syntax that we're going to be using with fetch. And in order to chain something to a resolved promise, what we can do is we can use the then method. A promise will have a then method which would take a successfully resolved promise object. Okay? So what that is going to take is it's going to take some type of value, which would be the resolved promise itself. So if I made this fetch request, it would be the actual response to that request, right? Does that make sense to you guys? All right. So I'm going to create a function which then takes in this response that I just got, and I'm going to return something right out of that response. And what I'm going to return is the response, and then I'm going to invoke this JSON method. So fetch gives us the ability to actually grab the JSON data that came back with our response. So here I can say return response, and then I'm going to invoke the JSON method to give me back the JSON that I got in my request. And then I actually need to chain it one more time to get that particular resolved promise. So this is going to return another promise right here, and then I can work with it in here inside my second .then. Okay. So it's like in some ways, it's slightly more verbose than what we saw with the jQuery example. Because in the jQuery example, we either did $.ajax and then we did success and just put a function in there, or we did if we were doing $.get, we just put our success function as the second argument, right? Okay.
So nothing goes in that then, like second then function?
Well, something is going to go inside the second then function. So in the second then here, our resolved promise is going to be what? It's going to be the actual JSON, because that's what this is going to resolve to. When I invoke the JSON method, it's going to give me back that JSON in one big object. All right? So now we can create a function that would actually handle that JSON that we got. And I'm just going to call it data. Actually, we called it stuff, so let's stick with that. Stuff's kind of cool. All right? And then I could also have, optionally, if I want to have a .catch that I chain to that, when would this run, do you guys think? Yeah, if something was rejected, right? And that could happen at any step in the way. So if I had a problem inside here, inside that second .then, my .catch would also run. Okay. All right, so inside the .catch, for now, we'll just do a console.log. I don't think we'll run into any problems with the Star Wars API. It tends to be pretty solid from my experience. So inside this second .then, though, again, we now have access to our JSON, and that's what we wanted ultimately. So let's grab this here. Paste that in. Indent it a little bit properly, and then I'm just going to rip this out here. Okay. All right, so again, we had some reference to a dollar sign here. Do we have access to that now? No, we don't. So how could we get reference to this particular element? So it's our contents div. Yeah, we can do get element by ID, right? And I could do that up here if I want. So I could say contents div equals document.get element by ID. And then we'll just pass in contents. Okay. So now here, what we can do is we can create a node. So I can say document.create element. And then what kind of element am I creating? I'm creating a paragraph, right? Okay. And then what I can specify is I can say, whoops, I actually want to save this to something. So we'll say const paragraph equals that element that I'm creating. And then I could say the paragraph's inner text equals this string that we had down here. Actually, let me not grab those p tags, because the p tag is actually the element itself, so we don't need that part, right? Equals that. And then what I can do is I can say document.body.append child, and then I could just append that specific element that I just created. I can append that paragraph. All right? Get rid of this part here.
If you never, I thought you were going to do
Yeah, I think at the top about the content. Created content.
Yeah, you created the concept at the top.
Yeah, let's do that. Sorry. I was appending it to the document body, but yeah, let's actually use contents div. Good eye, guys. All right, so.
You never append it. You just create a paragraph that exists nowhere.
Wait, what do you mean we never appended it?
Okay, yeah, if you never append the child, yeah, does it still create it?
for that.
It creates it, but it never gets added to the
it never
actual
goes
DOM.
anywhere.
Yeah, it's
Where
not
does it-
actually in the
Where does
document.
it get created when that's happening?
Just in memory.
So would you be able to access it via the cache still?
Well, let's think about this. So notice where we're actually creating this paragraph right in here, right? We're only doing it inside of the loop. Is this going to be accessible anywhere else? Nope. Totally isolated to this particular block of code right here. So no, you wouldn't be able to access that to anywhere else. Now, however, if I did something way out here, if I created, say, just an empty array, and then I started adding some of these paragraphs that I'm creating into that array, then it would actually be accessible. But as it stands now, nothing else will be able to touch this because it's nested inside that little loop. Okay? And you guys can see here our code is essentially working exactly the way that it was the other day. So if I click this, I can keep appending new Star Wars characters. BB-8. Yeah. Any questions?
Besides personal preference, is there an advantage in using this over jQuery or the other way around in given situations?
Generally, jQuery has fallen out of favor in the last few years. As these other frameworks have come into their own, React and Angular and Vue, people are using jQuery less and less. Because in the early days, probably some 10 years ago or so, jQuery was really popular because it smoothed out a lot of the inconsistencies between the browsers. So, you may not be able to get the expected behavior if you're just doing vanilla JavaScript back then. Nowadays, a lot of those inconsistencies have already been smoothed out. So as we can see, we can largely use fetch across different browsers without having to worry about, is this going to be compatible or not.
So would just vanilla JavaScript be more applicable in Angular?
With Angular, we're actually going to have this thing called an HTTP client, which will help us make AJAX requests. So the syntax won't be exactly the same as fetch. But again, I just wanted to show you guys a different way to do it. So if you were not working in Angular, if you just had something, say a vanilla JavaScript project, you can easily use fetch. There's no reason why you need to bring in jQuery for something like that. Yeah. There's even a lower level version of making AJAX requests. It's using something called an XML HTTP request. But chances of you having to use that are extremely low. So that's what you'd use if you were concerned about compatibility with fetch and you didn't want to use jQuery or something like that. You could make like a wrapper function for this other thing, this XML HTTP request, if you really wanted to do it that way. And that would ultimately be pretty compatible with everything. So any browser should be able to make an XML HTTP request. Any other questions about how we structured our code here? Does that generally make sense to you guys?
There's no ready. You don't need this ready because there's no jQuery going on.
No, yeah. The reason why I didn't do the ready is because we've already So the HTML is going to be parsed in order. So we've already rendered this out by the time we even get down here.
But if you were to put it up into the head, then you would have to use document.
Then you might want to, yeah.
But you still couldn't. You still wouldn't be using the jQuery syntax, right?
No, exactly. So if we were to put this script up here, we might do something like document, and then we would add an event listener to that, and then we could say when the DOM content was loaded, I would want to do all this stuff that I had down below. So I can grab all of this code, oops. And then just put that up in there. Yeah, exactly. So our indentation obviously is going to move a little bit to the right. However, what you could do if you didn't want your indentation to keep moving, because the reason why it's doing that is because we're using callbacks. But what you could do is you could take any time we created like an anonymous function, we could turn that into an actual named function, and then just declare that function up above and define it as well, and then we could just refer to it by name. So rather than
And that's like what you're doing
yeah, so rather than .add event listener click and then putting the whole function definition in here, I can just put the name of the function that I wanted to run. And that way we wouldn't have this situation where our indentation keeps moving to the right.
Yeah.
And that's affectionately known as callback hell. Yeah, because it sort of starts to look like this triangular thing.
Like with the, if you have the rainbow extension, it turns out red.
Yes.
When it comes to like error handling in this context,
Mhm.
like obviously you're going to be into turning to the router, but if you were to use like a socket
Mhm.
to import the error back to the server, with that, but like if the error already happens, then how do you know it's like how serious that error is? Like if something goes wrong on the client side, how do you inform the server in a safe way? If you want to do that.
Mm-hmm. Well, in this case, we don't even have a server, right? I mean, we're literally, yeah, just running an HTML file. But you're saying, so if you had an application that had both a front end and a back end,
Yeah.
okay. So, well, you could easily send if you're using sockets, then it would be very easy to send a message back to your server with that information. And I think only maybe two or so of you are in sockets yet, but you guys will see sockets next week. They're pretty cool. Yeah, socket. So so I saved the file and I moved all the code up here into the head, and I've got it inside that DOM content loaded event listener right now, and then I just tested the same thing. Yes.
Is it generally more efficient to do all the requests on the client side or on the server side, and then just render it?
Well, there may actually be reasons why you would need to do them on the server side. So for instance, if I'm interacting with some outside API, and that API requires that I use a secret key to authenticate myself, or something like that, I don't want to actually expose that on the client side. Okay, so if I'm just doing it on the client side and I make that request with those keys, now anyone can see my keys and they can make requests on my behalf. I don't really want them to do that, right?
But other than that, do we always want to do the request on the client side?
It really depends. If you're making requests to your own server, to your own backend, it can create a nice smooth experience. Because we don't have to do, say we're taking in some kind of a form submission, right? We don't have to actually go through that whole hard page refresh of making the request, doing the processing, and so forth. I can do that stuff on the server side just by making an AJAX call. But sometimes when you're interacting with outside APIs too, they may not allow you to make client side requests to their API. So they can refuse using something called cores, which just means they don't want these requests to be coming from different domains than their own. But when you're making the request through a server, as Alan was talking about, you don't have to worry about cores. Cores is only a client-side issue. Any other questions? We good on this? Thumbs? All around? Good? All right, cool. You guys are dismissed. Off to work.
Potluck time.
Potluck.
Simple start to